Hi, this is Roger with a croaky throat. Thanks for dropping by. We haven't done an update on these two plants for some time. Now these two Miltonias are in a feeding project for 2021, just the two of them. And the project, if you haven't come across it, where have you been? It was based on picking two plants that, as near as damn it, were almost identical, because this really is not a scientific project. It's a sort of bit of fun with a bit of realism in it, let's say. And these two plants were in a very, very similar position. So they were both reasonably mature plants, bloomed, and both plants had 4 new growths. Now that's the unusual bit, is to get plants with exactly the same growth pattern, if you see what I mean, on mature plants anyway. So that's why they were chosen, is their similarity. They're not exactly the same. Now the first thing I'm going to identify now is that this plant was bought as Miltonia spectabilis. It is possible it's a spectabilis cross, and if it is, I don't know what it's crossed with. So that puts an element of unknown into that plant. This one over here was actually sold as a Morleana hybrid. So this one was actually bought as possibly, you know, the original species with crossed with something else. But again, an unknown something else. The problem I've got is with not knowing what's gone into the cross, there could be what's called hybrid vigor, which is just a phenomenon that happens that when you've got a plant that grows in a certain manner and you cross it with another plant that grows in a similar manner, between the two of them they suddenly get into a vigorous plant. Just the mix just does something odd, and it's called hybrid vigor. It doesn't always occur. You can try your luck, and sometimes it doesn't work. And the growth habit, size of the bulbs, you know, regularity of new growths and everything is exactly the same as the originals. But sometimes you just get something that bursts forth and grows like mad. Anyway, what we've got, we had our 4 new growths. Now on this plant, they're coming out at all funny angles. So we've got one here. Well, that one has a spike. So we have spike number 1 on growth number 1. This is growth number 2. Well, that has a spike sticking out the top. So that's 2 out of 4 so far. So I've got to find them all. Right, this is growth number 3 round here. That also has a spike. And then where the hell's growth number 4 then? Ah, growth number 4 is tucked in here. And that's got a spike too. So we have 4 spikes on this. On all 4 new growths we have a spike. What else is the plant doing? Nothing. I'll tell you why I put that question in there, because the other plant is. So this one is currently pushing up spikes. And at the moment that's all it's doing. Am I? It sounds like I'm putting the plant down, doesn't it? It's because I've just looked at both of them to get me head in gear. There's nothing wrong with this. If this was the only plant I've had, to get a spike on all 4 blooms, I'd be over the moon. So we're going to get blooms on this. I don't know how long these are going to take to get to actual blooming size, these spikes, on the grounds that I bought it in bloom. So this is my first rebloom. Now this one has been fed and watered with all my other normal pots. Nothing different has happened to this one. So it'll have been flushed at the same frequency as the others. It will have been watered with the same feed levels as all the others. This is my normal pots, not cooler, shadier stuff or anything odd, or Derek's plants, or this is just the normal pots. Not the holy clay pots, just the normal pots. So that's that plant. And I would say I'm very pleased with its progress. Very pleased. Get 4 new growths. Not mature yet, that's for sure. They haven't developed their bulbs in full yet. I am hoping to get some good sized bulbs. Right, so that's the spectabilis. Now let's have a look at the Morelliana probable hybrid. Going back to the original label, it did have the word hybrid on it. So it's a Morelliana crossed with something undetermined. Virtually certain of that. Now this also had 4 new growths. So if we start with the one by the green tag, the green tags and the red tags were to remind me that these two are in a project, and to remind me which one's which. In other words, which one gets the normal feed, which one gets the higher feed. So this one, when there was a flush on the go, this one got flushed. When there was a feed on the go, this one got a feed considerably higher than the other one. So it had its own little feeding schedule, this one. Now, this is how scientific it is. At the end of the day, the plants aren't identical. So this plant could be growing better for no other reason than the hybrid vigour. It could be for no other reason than it developed its roots a bit quicker. So it takes on board more sooner than the other one did. You see, it's not scientific. It can't be. First of all, I haven't got a lab. But, you know, for a bit of fun. So starting at the green label then, this new growth is pushing on and has a nice spike. The spike on this growth is larger than any of the spikes on the previous plant. That's quite obvious. Okay, coming round to growth number 2 here. And we have a spike just showing down here. So we've got a spike on growth number 2. We get to growth number 3 round here, we have a large spike. So this one's pushing on nicely. So that's growth number 3, has a spike too. And last but not least, growth number 4 has a spike equally as big as growth number 3. So the spikes on this plant are more advanced. They look thicker and stronger. Yeah? Now, go back to the question I asked on the other one, what else is the plant doing? The reason I asked it on that plant is because on this plant, we've got a new growth. Now that's not a new growth on a new growth, that's a new growth on an existing growth. So that brings to the total of new growths on this plant 5, although this one is a long way behind. So it's had an afterthought, this plant, and pushed out an extra growth. So again, all 4 growths have a spike. The spikes are more advanced on this plant. Yeah, that may be nothing to do with the feeding. It may be. You have to make your own mind up on this. I'm doing it for a bit of fun. I'll give you some figures on feed levels in a minute. In fact, I will add on to the end a look at the spreadsheet that I've kept that's got all the facts and figures and dates in. So we're going to have a look at that. Right, the other thing was the new growth started with no roots, obviously. So if we go back to this plant and have a look at the root progress, and we do have roots. This growth is a little bit high, yeah, so a lot of its roots have been aerial, but they've made their way down towards the pot, yeah. So again, this one was a bit high, but we've got good root growth on those new growths. Now this one, virtually all of the new growths were sat right on the media. That's a bit of luck. They are all producing new roots quite nicely, and they are, in the main, going down into the media. In both cases, I wouldn't say I've got a pot full of roots yet, but I'm confident I will have. As the season progresses, yeah, these 2 plants have got active root growth on all 8 of those new growths, 4 on each plant. They're still growing, so they're going to carry on down into the pots, and we should end up with some good root systems on both of these 2 plants. Okay, so you can make judgments for yourself. This Spectabilis may or may not be a hybrid. I can't prove that one way or the other. And even when we get the blooms, I doubt if we'll prove it one way or the other. This one is highly likely to be a Morelliana hybrid, because it did have the word hybrid on the label. All that means is that part of the plant, probably half of the plant, is the species, and the other half is made up of something else, which could also be a hybrid. The other half of the plant could be another Morelliana cross, which would take the total Morelliana higher than just half. You see what I mean? When it's undetermined, you can only guess. But the good thing is we're going to get blooms on both of them. Right, so that's the update on the plants after, I think, the other video I did. What I'll do is I'll put the playlist at the end of the video, so you can go back and watch the previous videos. There's not many in this playlist. I think there's 2 or 3 already in the playlist. I think this will make it 4. But what we'll do now is go and plug into the computer and drag off the facts and figures from the spreadsheet that I've been keeping, which I will carry on keeping. This is a project through to the end of the season, when these have finished growing, basically. So I'm going to keep going until probably the blooms have finished. Bearing in mind they've only just started their spikes at the moment. Both of these plants produce pretty tall spikes, yeah, so they've got a lot of growing to do yet. So let's go and have a look at some facts and figures. Okay, so we're looking at the spreadsheet now that I set up. It's probably not big enough to see the detail on a phone, but if you've got a reasonable screen you should be able to see something. I'm going to talk down through it anyway. So plant number 1 on the left was the Spectabilis, and plant number 2 is the Morelliana. Basically I put some notes in there talking about the repot, which was done in November last year. Plant number 1 was 3 pieces, potted in Burnham's bark, charcoal and sponge rock mix. Plant number 2 was 2 pieces, potted in the same stuff. And then effectively the project proper we started towards the end of January, and at that point they had a flush. I've put the, obviously I'm using RO water, I've put the TDS and the pH in as an average. I don't measure it. At the end of the day, my TDS for my RO water is around 9. Sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 11. The pH is around 6.8, sometimes it's 6.9, sometimes it's actually 7. Anyway, so that was our starting sort of point. And then we did a video on the 29th of January. That was the first video in the project. I'll actually put the playlist up at the end of the video if you want to go back and watch there aren't a huge number of videos in this project. So basically both plants had a brief description. Plant number 1, 4 new growths, 1 chosen to monitor, currently 105 millimeters long, and we forgot to continue measuring them. That just didn't happen, I'm afraid. New roots under the new growths, not yet started, but signs showing. So the little nubbins were just there on the new growths, and obviously bulbs were not yet forming. Looking at the other plants, the one that was chosen to monitor was a little bit bigger, but not enough to worry about. Roots under the new growths, again not yet started, but signs showing, bulbs not forming. So these were in a very, very similar position at this point in time, back at the end of January. And then what I've done is each time these plants have either been flushed or fed, I've recorded the values on the left hand side for plant 1 and down this column for plant 2. So we'll just quickly roll down through. The first feed, basically I use MSU, so I've put the MSU TDS value in there and the pH. And the difference between the 2 feeds on feed number 1, probably you could class that as negligible. But plant number 1 had a TDS of 105, plant number 2 had TDS of 140. They were then followed by a flush. In the next round of pot watering, they were both still wet, so they didn't get anything at all. And then they were flushed. So not a lot happening at the moment. At this point, so we're now into the beginning of March, the second video was produced. And in this video, the signs of the new roots under the new growths were pushing on. Yeah, so the new roots were starting to push out, a little bit more visible at this point. Then we're carrying on with the feed. Plant number 1 had a TDS of 110. Plant number 2 had a TDS of 195. There are slight variations in the pH on these feeds, not enough to worry about. The thing that's going to make it grow is the nitrogen, and that's going to go in as long as the pH is 6 or above probably. They then had 2 flushes on the trot. Yeah, it's winter time, short days,
cold night temperatures and sometimes cold day temperatures too. They're not growing much, so they don't need a lot of feed. We get on to the third feed of the project. Plant number 1 had a TDS of 165 with some CalMag, taking it up to 195. Plant number 2 had a TDS of 265, CalMag taking it up to 285. Yeah, so higher feed. We then had another flush, and then we had what was the fourth feed? TDS for plant number 1 260, plant number 2 365, and they both had a low pH on this run. Yeah, I do vary my pH. A normal pH for me is 6.5, 6.6. A low pH would be around the 6.0 mark, possibly 5.9. I don't go any lower than that simply because the pH will drop in the pot, and obviously the pot's not going to dry out immediately, so there's a reservoir of feed in the pot which the plant can take advantage of until the media is dry, and all the time the pH will be dropping, so I don't go in that low with my pH. Where did we get to? Forgotten now. Anyway, you can see the process. I'm not going to go through every single one. So bringing it up to date now, the last pot run I did was on the 16th of the 6th, and plant number 1 had a TDS of 180 and calcium nitrate added up to take it up to 230. So quite a high percentage of calcium nitrate. Why would that be being increased as we head through the year? The plants are growing more, we've got longer days, we've got good temperatures. Yeah, they're going to use that nitrogen, that extra nitrogen, and if they start using it, they need the calcium to back it up, or they'll go all wishy-washy and floppy. Too much nitrogen and you'll get sappy growth. You know, leaves will bend halfway along because they're too heavy to support themselves, all that sort of stuff. Plant number 2 had an overall TDS of 330. Why haven't I split it? I haven't split it because of the way I do it. So the original water that I was using would had a TDS of 180 with a measured calcium nitrate added in. And then what I do is I add some more feed in. So I end up with an unknown balance between the two elements. So all I can say is that the total TDS was 330 and in there was some calcium nitrate. And I didn't bother measuring the pH this time round. In all the times that I've checked the two pHs, increasing the feed usually drops the pH by 1.2 at the most. So if plant number 1 had a pH of 6.4, the chances are plant number 2's pH was 6.3, possibly 6.2. Not enough to make a major difference in the nutrient absorption. Yeah. So that's the way the project's running, and I will do another update probably when the blooms start opening. That'll be a significant point to have a look, because at that point we can look at the progress of the roots, how big the growths are, whether the bulbs are forming, and you know, shall I open a book? Do you want to lay bets on which plant opens its blooms first? Now, plant number 2 has at least one spike that looks quite a bit bigger than any of the spikes on plant number 1, so you might assume that will open its blooms first. But what if plant number 2 has to grow much longer spikes before the buds open? In which case plant number 1 could get there first. Now you can see how scientific this is. Not. It's a bit of fun. It's not a science project. It can't be. The plants are not identical enough to do that. And yeah, I mean, I'm just doing it for my own interest, really. I just thought I'd drag you people along in case you're interested. But we won't really know until we get to the very end of the season, when the blooms have finished, the bulbs have finished maturing and have reached their maximum size, and the plant will settle down into a non-growth mode for a while, and then we start the whole thing again with a set of new growths, so which we won't be following. I'm not doing it again for another year. So there we go then. That's how the project's progressed so far. That's the first, what I would call, major update that we've done, and from my point of view, both plants are progressing nicely. and whether my higher feed level on plant number 2 is making a difference or not, I wouldn't like to say, quite honestly. I wouldn't like to say, on the grounds that there is a bit of something else in that plant. It's not a pure species, and that could be having a major influence on its growth rate and all that sort of thing. So, but it's still a bit of fun. Okay, right, the playlist, which has only got a few videos in, it's not a massive playlist. I think there's either 2 or 3 videos in there, and this one will go in as well. That will pop up at the end of the video after I stop rabbiting, so you can go back and choose to watch some of that if you feel like it. It's up to you. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for dropping by.